Thanks for coming to my online talk, the talk I was due to give in Belfast until the coronavirus crisis kicked off. I'm Adam Ramsay from Open Democracy, and today I'm going to talk about what I call manufactured alienation, the war on democracy, how people came to hate democracy, and how we should fight back. And for me, this story sort of starts many years ago when I had a job back in 2003 and early 2004 as what I would call a peripatetic chugger, which meant that I travelled around the UK, being one of those annoying people who stop you in the street and ask you for £5 a month for a charity. And I worked for Amnesty International, and in fact, that took me around Northern Ireland for a couple of weeks, getting to know lots of corners of Northern Ireland and also around England. And as a Scottish teenager, I'd not been to England much before, so I kind of discovered England that way. And it taught me to spend a lot of time kind of talking to people in the street about politics, and that the way you learn about politics in the world is just by going to places and talking to people, and that people are generally quite happy to chat to you about their views, and everyone has their own opinions, and that politics in a sense is the kind of mass of those opinions and how they're formed. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how I spent February, which was travelling around Central Europe, stopping people in the street, talking about their views of politics. And these are largely in countries like Hungary, which are run by quite an increasingly autocratic and far-right leaders often, and how it is those leaders maintain popular support, despite the fact that people from outside might think they're horrific. And I'm going to talk through some of the kind of things people said to me and how I've tried to interpret and understand that. But before I do that, I just want to quickly introduce kind of three quick ideas that some of my favorite thinkers have come up with in the past, which help me to think about this stuff people have said to me and help me think about how we need to understand it. And the first comes from the Welsh theorist, Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams was particularly a critic and kind of a great thinker. And he talked about what he called structures of feeling, which you can define as the different ways of thinking vying to emerge at one time in history. He said that sort of this idea of hegemony, that, you know, that kind of there's a common sense across society is never complete. And there's lots of different ideas kind of going around that are built up through the population, through time, and through a whole load of different kind of cultural processes. And so, you know, you can go and read in old textbooks about what people might think about different problems in society, but I like to try and understand the actual structures of feeling that are arising right now, and then talk to people about why. And the way I like to do that is by just going to places, talking to people, and having, you know, writing down those conversations. And of course, that's not scientific, but I find it very interesting. The second idea I just want to introduce quickly is the concept of alienation. The Scottish trade unionist Jimmy Reid defined the alienation as the cry of women who feel themselves the blind victims of economic forces beyond their control. It's the frustration of all people excluded from the processes of decision making, feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel with justification that they have no real say in shaping or determining their own destinies. And where people like Karl Marx, who kind of first introduced these ideas, talked about alienation in the context of capitalist workplaces, Jimmy Reid argued that the concentration of power in the economic field is matched by the centralization of decision-making in the political institutions of society. I'm going to come back to this theme again and again, and I think it's something that we all need to think about a lot more if we want to think about the kind of trouble that our democracy is in right now. The third idea I want to introduce, and it's going to become obvious why in a moment, but it might seem a bit technical at the moment, is a word, reification, which you might know already, but in kind of social science jargon, it's the transformation of a social process into a thing. So the German word that it's based on literally means making into a thing. You can think of it as thingification. And the Hungarian philosopher, I'm going to talk a lot about Hungary, so I thought I'd give you a theorist from Hungary, Georgi Lukács, argued that reification is inherent to capitalism, because capitalism takes the sort of social processes that we're all involved in, it puts a boundary around them, it wraps them up, and it sells them back to us as a product. So you can think about, you know, the difference between liking to go for a wander in the countryside with your friends and the industry of hiking, which sells you lots of gear. Or I'm going to talk about how this applies to politics in a moment. I want to think through what I call the 5 stages of alienation. And this is based largely on my experience over the last 15 years of traveling most recently around Central Europe, as I said, but also a lot around the UK over a long period, talking to people about politics in the street and in bars and cafes, and talking to strangers everywhere from Derry to Norwich and the southwest of England to northeast of Scotland and beyond, and the kind of way that understanding has shifted in that time. And for me, the first stage, which is largely historical, is what I would call capitalist realism, which is a term coined by a writer called Mark Fisher, which can be summed up by the sort of famous slogan of Margaret Thatcher: there is no alternative. So back when I was a student in the kind of early noughties, and when I was first spending a lot of time, whether it was campaigning or working or for whatever reason, stopping people in the street, talking about politics, the most common kinds of statement you get from people were things like, they're all the same, or I'm not really interested in politics, or I don't see the point. And this is kind of a very passive attitude to politics. And people would sometimes, say that, oh, all these people, they just don't care. But my experience was, you talk to them, of course, that they did care. They cared about themselves and their families and their lives and people they loved and their broader communities. They just didn't believe the political system really changed anything. So they were disengaged from it. They were, as I would say, alienated from it. But it was in a very passive way. They weren't particularly cross about this. They were getting on with their lives. They were busy with other things. And often they would see politics as a kind of technocracy and a technical skill that someone else had and they didn't have to bother with. But that began to change with the 2008 banking crisis. So that is when I think we first started to move on to the next stage, which can be summed up with, I don't trust any of them. And so I met a woman called Jade outside the Atos building in Crewe right before the recent UK election. And she said, I don't know what to believe. All these facts keep flying around on Facebook. Or I spoke to a guy in Eastern Hungary, this town called a guy called Zoltan, in Nyíregyháza, which is a city in Eastern Hungary, which votes for the far-right party Fidesz, which is currently governing Hungary. And he said something which almost everyone says, which is they say one thing and they do another. And huge numbers of people. So when I was in Slovakia, it was right before the general election. And the most common answer I got to the question, how do you feel about the election, was, I don't know who I'm going to vote for. It was sort of frustrated. People didn't feel excited by any of the candidates. There was no sense of kind of positivity about the election. People were going to vote. They didn't like the incumbent government, but none of the opposition parties had really kind of managed to channel a positive energy. A man in the kind of beautiful mountain town of Poprad in eastern Slovakia said to me, everybody says things will get better, this will get better, that will get better, but after the election, nothing had changed. And so, these are absolutely standard responses, and you've probably seen them in your own lives, among your own families, among your friends. I think they also come in another form, which is what I call politics as reality TV. So a guy in Košice in eastern Slovakia, two different people in Nyíregyháza in eastern Hungary all said to me, what are you doing here? Politics happens, if it's Slovakia, in Bratislava, or in Hungary, they say in Budapest. Politics isn't, for those people, a process they take part in, like kind of friendship or family, only more formalized on a bigger scale, which is what I think it should be. It's how we as a society make decisions together. But rather it's a process that they watch. So people would say, it's a circus, it's a big theatre. And again, you're probably familiar with people in your life, maybe even yourself, saying these things, thinking about politics as a thing that you watch on your TV or, that happens in a parliament building far away from you, rather than a process that you're involved in negotiation about how we live together in society. And that's when we get to stage 3, which I think is a kind of angrier stage. I think we saw a lot of this in the recent UK election. So also at the Atos building in Crewe, there were lots of great interviews in the rain there. This guy Wes said to me, politics, democracy, sod the lot of them. I don't believe any of it. Now the interesting thing about Wes is he told me he reads pretty much every newspaper every day. And throughout the election, he was a very information intensive citizen. He was following it very closely. He cared about it in that sense, but he wasn't going to vote, and he was furious. This wasn't the kind of passive, not interested in politics I used to get in 2007. This is a much more active, engaged rage. Or similarly in Poprad in central Slovakia, I spoke to his builder who said that we want choice. These men, we want choice. He was fed up with the lack of choice. And again, the tone was angry. This wasn't the same kind of passive disengagement as before. I won't vote. People swear a lot, politics, fuck off, said one guy to me in Eastern Hungary. As another guy, actually also in Eastern Hungary, said to me, why the fuck are you asking? And he told me he would normally beaten me up for asking a question like that. How do you feel about politics? So these people are actively excluded. And there's lots of other examples of them. So I spent the 2016 American election wandering around the West Bank in Palestine, interviewing people, asking them how they felt about that election. And while Israeli settlers there in kind of the front line of the conflict were very big Trump fans and were, I would say, largely fascists, the Palestinians almost all said the same thing. They had this line which was they'd go back through the US presidents throughout their life and they'd say Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, they're all the same. It makes no difference to us. And this wasn't the kind of passive, they're all the same of the kind of pre-crash years in the UK. This is very active, they're all the same. Or similarly, there's like the actively excluded groups who've never been asked for their vote. So I spent a couple of days going around Roma settlements in eastern regions of Slovakia and Hungary, where about 10% of the population are Roma, and they're arguably the most marginalized ethnic group in Europe, or certainly one of them. And I would ask people questions like, has anyone ever asked you for your vote? To which they'd normally laugh and say, well, no, of course not. I mean, no one cares about us. And they either didn't vote, or they only voted for often the far right party in Hungary, Fidesz, because they are the only people who had ever actually asked for their vote, even though Fidesz mobilized racism against Roma people as a key part of their rhetoric. But they bother to engage people when no one else does. And actively in Hungary, there's a kind of next stage of that, which is a lot of people are banned from talking about politics publicly. So, for example, a fireman told me that while, actually his wife told me that he's not allowed to talk to me about politics, even anonymously, because he could lose his job because he works for the state. So they banned a whole group of people, all state employees, from criticising the government. They're only allowed to say positive things. And then there's stage 4 of the process of alienation, which I think can be summarised by they're all corrupt. So about a year ago, I was in Biella in northern Italy, which is now on absolute lockdown because of coronavirus. And the guy said to me, we're the most corrupt country in Europe. In Mukacheva, in western Ukraine, where I was last month, a young man said to me, there's lots of bandits, they kill people for money and territory. And in the town, there were policemen going around in groups of 3, sort of strutting around with machine guns, because the previous week there had been shootings on the street. So, that is a real threat. Then there was a kind of interesting use of racist language in Hungary. So one young man said, Fidesz, they're all gypsies, implying, because he believed that Roma people, that gypsies are all thieves, as he saw it, which of course there's no evidence for, but it's a racist stereotype. And he applied that to the government, even though the government is notorious for being racist against Roma people. And I could go on, but I blame the people. Someone said too many lack courage. But the point is, there's this very angry sense the government is entirely corrupt. It's this body far away from us, and it's just corrupt. Politics isn't something we partake in. It's something that that we witness, and that these people involved in it are just crooks. This guy again in Slovakia said to me, "We're all corrupt. You, me, all of us." I think that's when we begin to get that down to what we might call clientelism, and I think we can begin to understand some of the politics. So you see this in Northern Ireland too, for example. You talk to DUP voters. I spent a long time talking to DUP voters in loyalist areas who'll spend the first half of the conversation telling you how much they hate the DUP before coming around to saying that despite that, they're going to vote for them. And so we need to begin to understand this. And then there's the final stage, which you might describe as fascism. And the way I tend to tell this story is that the week before the UK election last year, in December last year, I went around the north of England and I spent an evening in Hartlepool interviewing a homeless guy there who'd lost his legs because he'd been forced onto universal credit. That meant he couldn't pay his rent, so he ended up being homeless because sleeping on the streets exacerbated sores on his legs. They ended up being amputated. And he told me that there were these two teenagers who beat him up most nights. And as I was kind of near him later on the phone, he told me that after I got off the phone, he told me that the two teenagers were just kind of past us up the street and were waiting for me to go away so they could beat him up. So I stayed with him and ended up talking to these teenagers. And they said, when I asked them why they beat up homeless people around town, which they admitted to doing, and they said, it's people like him, and then they use various racial terms, you know, people like him and I won't use the words, who make this place a shithole, they said, these two 15-year-olds. And so they like to, as they see it, clean these people off the streets. Similarly, in 2018, I was in Miskolc in Eastern Hungary, and a police officer there told me that the Roma are the problem here. A woman in Poprad in central Slovakia told me the problem is the LGBT agenda. The problem is a gender ideology. Said two different young men in Košice in Slovakia who were all voting for the neo-Nazi party, which ended up getting about 10% in the election there. And the way I would understand that is that what we see is once the powerful have become so distant, when you talk to these people, what you discover is they don't even count the powerful in their equation. And so instead, they try and blame anyone else different from them they can see, and that's usually the powerless. And so they end up kicking down. And that leads to the development of these explicitly fascist ideas. And so, you know, and in general, I think these processes benefit the right, because if politics is a spectator sport, then those who own the media have more power because people are watching it. It's not about things that they participate in. And that's mostly regime-aligned oligarchs, both in the UK and in Hungary. You know, that's equally true in West and East, although we tend to talk about it in Eastern Europe more, because we're taught to trust national ruling classes as seen through nationalist lenses, whether that's posh people in Britain or rich people in America or so on. And most importantly, I think, because progressives tend to argue, any kind of progressive politics is an argument that big decisions you make as a society should be made through democratic means, whether that's the state or other kinds of democracies. Whereas conservative or right-wing arguments tend to argue for decision-making through the market or through kind of authoritarian nationalism or through traditional racial or gender or religious hierarchies. And so the less people trust in democracy and the state, the more they lean towards those other kinds of institutions. So for example, a woman in Czechia in this kind of post-communist housing block right on the edge of Prague said to me last month, she said, I don't believe in politics. So I said, what do you believe in? And she said, I believe in the family. So who does she vote for? She votes for one of the kind of further right parties because she saw them as protecting the family. And similarly, we see the same phenomenon in the UK, where in the last recent election, Boris Johnson argued to get Brexit done, get politics out of the way, etc. And Labour tried to articulate this case to the many, not the few, but people I spoke to interpreted that as they're promising to use politics to give us lots of nice things, and we just don't trust them. We don't believe politics, and we don't believe we can deliver nice things. So why would we believe them? Now, I'm just going to run through how we need to understand some of this. One of the tools I use to do so is the kind of investigative journalism that my colleagues and I have been involved in, because part of these processes are kind of inevitable consequences of economic shifts. So in the last 40 years, you've seen massive privatizations, we've seen huge deregulations. So it is the case that more and more decisions have been shifted away from democratic fora and into the market. That's the process that neoliberalism was. Neoliberalism, which I think is now dead, but you know, that's what we've gone through over the last 40 years. It's not surprising that people felt politics had less power and less relevance to their life and became more and more a spectator sport. But at the same time, that feeling has been actively played upon. So I was undercover at this dinner in London when I was investigating some dark money that was spent by the DUP in the Brexit election, which meant Brexit referendum, which many people in Northern Ireland might be familiar with, the story about the 435,000 dark money that my colleagues and I broke. And I met this guy who used to work for Theresa May, and who we discovered is now working for essentially a kind of smear operation which had run the attack ads against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 campaign and set up shop in the UK after the 2017 election, because the Conservatives got a massive fright in the 2017 election. And so they learned from America, as they always do, and they brought over these sort of smear operations to the UK. And when you look at what it is these smear operations do. You look, for example, at a story that we broke where we leaked a whole load of tapes that had been recorded by a staff member at Cambridge Analytica, the famous company that ran the Brexit campaign, essentially, sort of, and ran Trump's campaign for America. And what they say they do is they break down trust in their opponents so that their opponents' voters don't turn out. So it's very hard to persuade you to vote for my preferred candidate. It's much easier to persuade you not to trust your candidate so that you don't vote at all. And that's essentially what a lot of these operations do. So this particular man I met bragged to me that he had run the smear campaign against the MP for Kensington, where Grenfell is, immediately after the Grenfell Tower fire, so that she would stop being an articulate. I mean, this is me interpreting, but effectively that meant she stopped being an articulate voice attacking the government on behalf of the victims of the Grenfell Tower fire. And that's hugely effective politically because it pushes down the opposition and breaks down trust in politics as a whole. And as I said before, if you're on the right of politics, that tends to be to your advantage. We had the same in stories that we did investigating. So I was undercover in northern Italy last year, looking at how, where I spoke to the director of this group Citizen Go, which is a Spanish campaign group with huge numbers of online members right around the world. And what he said to me, he told me about how his strategy, I was playing to be a donor and I was offering him, I said, a six-figure sum for impacting the European elections. What he said to me is, you know, while he works very closely with the far-right parties right across Europe, and he offered to introduce me to figures from the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, and did introduce me to senior figures in Vox, the far-right party in Spain. But what he said to me is, you know, we don't actively campaign for those parties. What we do is we campaign against all their opponents. So they attack their opponents, they run kind of vicious attack adverts against all the other parties, and that drives down turnout for those other parties, which of course benefits their preferred party, the far-right parties across Europe. And they're learning that very actively from America. How do I know that? Because I met the guy they're learning it from, this guy, Darian Raffi, who's a Trump fundraiser. I also met when I was undercover at this conference. He's working now on developing technology, which can, if you go into a certain area, he says, we draw a polygon around an area like a Trump rally, although we know they do this in churches in the States as well. They extract all the data from your phone when you go into that area. So he said, we know what your favorite Netflix shows are. We know if you like Stranger Things. They get, you know, huge amounts of data from your phone. They follow you home, so they know where you live and who you are. And they use that data to target you with particular adverts. And that would allow them, we don't know exactly how they use it, but you don't need to make much of a leap to understand that allows them to do what he told me they did do, which is encourage some people to get out and vote. But also the implicit other side of that is that it does allow them potentially to drive down turnout for people they think won't vote for their candidate. And so that's exactly the kind of trick they're doing in the Trump election now, he told me. And this same person is teaching Citizen Go, which works with far-right parties right across Europe, to do the same thing, to actively promote this alienation from politics, this anger at politics, to make people not trust political institutions, not trust parties other than the far-right parties that they're working with in order to help boost support for the far right. So, you know, we saw the same in the Brexit campaign to a certain extent, with active attacks on some of the progressive forces there. But in particular, we saw it very actively in the UK general election, and we often, you know, huge amounts of money were spent on Facebook in particular by unknown groups with unknown sources of funding, attacking Jeremy Corbyn, attacking the Labour Party, and pushing a whole lot of messages which you'll all be familiar with if you follow UK politics at all, but which meant that Corbyn went from being able to mobilise quite a large chunk of the population in the 2017 election to totally, you know, loathed and hated by the 2019 election. Now, I don't mean that Corbyn himself didn't make huge mistakes and wasn't complicit in that process. I don't mean that, you know, they didn't get things wrong, but I think it's important to understand that all the criticisms of Corbyn, which particularly resonated with people who previously voted for him, were being promoted very actively online by dark money groups whose funding sources we still don't know. And so, who is it that benefits from this? Well, the one thing that's consistently true, and particularly true of the dark money that funded the Brexit campaign that we talked about, is that the people who benefited most are people who benefit from the UK's role as one of the world's leading money launderers, people with huge amounts of money offshore. So, for example, the major Brexit bankroller Aaron Banks, we know, traced his money to the Cayman Islands, to the Isle of Man, to Gibraltar, and also, a lot of people who have experience in making a lot of money from crisis, what you might call disaster capitalists. So just to give a stat from the election, from the day that the election was called, to videos posted by pages which were opposing Jeremy Corbyn and whose sources of funding were unknown, were viewed 16 million times. And it's not possible to trace how many saw their images, GIFs or memes. By contrast, anti-Brexit or pro-Labour right riders, so that's other pages supporting Labour or opposing Brexit, only managed around 4.7 million video views, so nothing like as much. And so I think that the question is, in my final 2 minutes, what can we do about this? The first thing to say is people hate politics because politics is awful. They don't trust the media largely because they're right not to trust the media, and they don't trust our politicians because our politicians really are quite awful. People are right to think that neoliberalism has rendered Western states corrupt, as post-colonial capital can no longer rely on geographical fix, so we can't extract wealth from the global south, prop up our economy anymore. So we need to think up new solutions for the new world we live in. For me, that means radical, deliberative, and empowering democracy. And that's the opposite of the kind of British state that we have right now, which is used as the world's money laundry, which gives vast power to a very small elite. We're one of the most unequal countries in the world. We've got some of the most centralized power in the world, whether that's the House of Lords or first past the post voting system, or even the way our civil service operates. And that means, I think, that we need to change our democracy through a constitutional convention. And the coronavirus crisis is showing quite how much British politics in particular, and the tendency towards British exceptionalism, is broken. And thank you for having me.